Dr. Moore, in a moment or two I'm going to ask Mary to ask you to take the oath. You are here with a very limited audience in this particular venue because of the particular COVID approach which we have to take at the moment. But you are talking to a much wider audience out there beyond what you say is being live streamed to them. Mary.
Please state your full name.
Roger John Moore.
And repeat after me. I do solemnly, sincerely.
I do solemnly, sincerely.
And truly declare and affirm.
And truly declare and affirm.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Dr. Moore, you're a doctor, but not a clinician, is that right?
That's absolutely right. Yes, I have a PhD.
And your academic area of speciality was in the field of engineering, but specifically in relation to materials and metals, is that correct?
That's absolutely right.
Now, you joined the Department of Health and Social Security in 1981, and your first post there was as a principal in the Supplies Division's Scientific and Technical Branch.
That is correct.
You were dealing there with matters relating to materials, surgical instruments, orthopaedic implants, dental materials, and quality standards in that regard.
Yes, I think the key point is that it was to do with quality assurance.
Now, you then, in October 1985, moved within the DHSS to a policy division known as HS1A.
Yes.
Again, you were a principal, that was your level of seniority, a principal officer, and the areas of responsibility with which you were involved then included the blood transfusion service, the Cbla, the Central Blood Laboratories Authority, and haemophilia care.
That's right.
So matters of direct relevance to the inquiry's terms of reference.
Yes.
And you remained in that post until December 1988. And then in January 1989, you became the Deputy National Director of the National Directorate of the Blood Transfusion Service. Yep. And we'll come back to this in more detail, but you were essentially the deputy to Dr. Gunson between 1989 and 1992.
That is correct. I mean, I deputised for him on everything except medical or clinical matters.
And although you were Deputy National Director of the Blood Transfusion Services National Directorate, you remained an employee of the Department of Health.
Yes, I was actually seconded.
That was a position you occupied until December 1992, and then you worked for the Department of Health in a range of roles not relevant to the inquiry's terms of reference from 1993 to 1999, is that right?
Yes.
And then 2000 to 2007, you were Chief Executive of the NHS Appointments Commission.
That is correct.
Now, my questions are going to cover two parts of your career. At that period, with HS1A, October 1985 to December 1988, and then your time as Deputy National Director of the National Directorate with the Blood Transfusion Service, so January 1989 to December 1992.
That's right.
But some of my questions will cut across both those chronological periods. But before we look at the first of those periods, I think there was something more general you wanted to say, picking up on some observations you made at the beginning of your witness statement.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to begin my evidence by remembering those who were infected by blood or blood products during the course of their treatment in the NHS. I'd particularly like to remember those who lost their lives, and I would like to take this opportunity to offer my profound sympathy to those who are still with us and those who were bereaved. And I would like to reassure them that I will do my part to allow the inquiry, hopefully, to provide some of the answers that they are looking for. Thank you.
Now, I'm going to explore with you, first of all, the nature, in general terms, of your role with HS1A and how HS1A worked. When you took up that role in 1985, covering these areas in relation to blood transfusion, haemophilia care, Cbla, etc., would it be right to understand that these were areas of policy making that were new to you?
That's absolutely right, yeah. I mean, my understanding was only what the layperson would have gathered from the newspapers.
And did you receive any particular briefings or information or training when you took up your post?
No, the department's way of ensuring that a new principal was up to speed was pretty much to throw them in at the deep end, and you learned on the job. You were mentored by colleagues.
And can you recall how the team was organised, the HS1A team dealing with these areas?
Yeah, there was myself leading the team, and I had two HEOs, executive officers, higher executive officers, and a clerical person reporting to me.
So a relatively small team?
A small team, yeah. But I think possibly of relevance is the fact that I worked very closely with a doctor from Med-SEB, and in my time that was Alison Smithies and later Dr. Hilary Pickles, but before Dr. Smithies I think it had been Dr. Walford.
And you referred in your witness statement to working with medical professionals, medical colleagues. You're talking about those internal DHSS
Yes.
colleagues that you've just referred to.
Yeah.
And then to whom did you report?
I reported to the Assistant Secretary, who was Malcolm Harris, and he would reported upward to John Cashman, who reported upward to Strawn Heppel, who reported upward to the Permanent Secretary.
We'll come on to some of the specific areas of policy or decision-making in which you were involved in a few minutes, but in general terms, are you able to assist us in understanding how policies or policy decisions were formulated within HS1A? Was it very much reactive, or was there a proactive approach?
I think it was both. We were reactive because part of our responsibility was to deal with ministerial correspondence, to understand the pressures that were on ministers, which were essentially reactive. But on the other hand, we attended meetings I attended meetings of the Cbla and also the transfusion directors' meetings. So that generated matters on which we could be proactive. So it was a mixture of both, I would say.
To what extent did you have communications or dialogue or any form of shared decision making with colleagues in the Scottish Home and Health Department?
We did on matters that crossed both departments, but and I did know who my counterparts were in SHHD, but yeah, I suppose on important matters we would liaise.
Well, I might try and pick up on
Sure.
some of those matters as we look at some of the issues. What about Wales and Northern Ireland? Was there much liaison there with the Welsh office or Northern Ireland?
I knew who my counterparts were, so we would have liaised where necessary.
In relation to Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, was there any kind of tacit expectation or indeed explicit expectation that they would follow the lead of the DHSS in London?
Yeah, I suppose we generally thought we were the senior department.
Now, you've referred to the fact that you attended meetings, and I want to look at some of the different aspects of your areas of responsibility, one of which was participating in a range of different meetings, either as an observer for the department or sometimes as part of a secretariat. Is that right?
That's right.
And I just want to look at a handful of them and then ask you some general questions about how the committee and group systems worked and the extent to which they were coordinated. So if we just look first of all at an example of meetings of regional transfusion directors. Paul, could we have on screen, please, NHBT 00182000? So, Dr. Moore, you'll see these are the minutes of the 198th Regional Transfusion Directors meeting, 22nd of January 1986. We can see from the right-hand column that you're in attendance. And if we look at the second paragraph under the heading Apologies, it says the thanks of the RTD meeting were expressed by the chairman to Mr. Alan Williams for his support, and the meeting welcomed Mr. Roger Moore, who has taken over this duty. So this was your first Regional Transfusion Director meeting. And I think it's right to understand, I haven't checked all of them, but you generally, if not invariably, attended the Regional Transfusion Director meetings from that point onwards. And then I'm not going to ask you about the detail of what was discussed at the meeting, but just so that we can get a flavour of the issues, we can see the bottom of that first page has a heading AIDS update, and there's a discussion to which Dr. Smithers, who was your medical colleague within the department, contributes. And then if we go over the page, we can see, for example, just about halfway down the page, there's an underlined heading Cbla Working Group on Quality Assurance, and there's discussions in relation to that. Next page, there's a discussion about the BGRL, so that's the Blood Group Reference Laboratory, I think. And then if we go over the page, we'll see there's a range of different issues discussed. Point 10, for example, notes on transfusion. That's the booklet that was produced by the Regional Transfusion Directors. And then, so just one more bit to look at. Page 6, Paul, top of the page. We'll come back to this, Dr. Moore, later in your evidence. But this is about the organisation of the National Blood Transfusion Service. We can see their reference to the National Management Board was going to look into its organisation. And we know that led in due course to the National Directorate. So is it right to understand that the Regional Transfusion Director meetings would discuss a range of different issues relevant to aspects of the blood transfusion service?
Yes, absolutely.
And what was your role as DHSS observer or participant in RTD meetings?
Well, I mean, clearly at that meeting I didn't speak at all because I was the new boy. But my role would have been to liaise between the directors' meetings and the department. So they would come up with an issue and they would say, what is the department's view on this? And I would be expected to go away and find out. And similarly, if the department wanted the view of the regional transfusions directors, then I would bring that to the meeting and they would discuss and I would take that back to the department.
And then a second category of meetings which you attended were the meetings of the Cbla. Again, we'll just look at one example. Paul, can we have BPLL 00111012, please? So we can see these are the minutes of the 23rd meeting of the Central Blood Laboratories Authority, 25th of March 1986. And then in attendance, we've got the members of the authority, and then we've got Mr. Armour, the Secretary, Dr. Lane as Director of BPL, and then you're there representing the DHSS. Again, what was your role in relation to the Cbla and its meetings?
Well, it was actually very similar to my role with the RTD's meeting. So I would go and observe, and they quite often had queries where they would want a guidance from the department. So if I wasn't able to give it at the time, I would take it back and undertake to give them the information they were looking for. And at the same time, when the department had concerns or inquiries about Cbla, then I would bring that to the meeting and it could be discussed.
Now, a third category of meetings which you attended, I don't have an example to display, but was EAGA, the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS.
Yep.
What was your role in relation to EAGA, as far as you can recall?
My role was quite minor compared with many other people there. It was a huge meeting. There could be up to 40 people sitting around the table representing all branches of public health and healthcare and public policy that might be affected by the HIV epidemic. I was there simply to speak up when anything relating to the blood transfusion transpired. But I really think mine was a minor role. It was an observing role.
And then, if we look at a fourth category of meetings, the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service. So if we could have, please, Paul, PRSE 40128. So we can see these are the minutes of the 12th meeting of the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service, 12th of March 1986. We can see it's chaired by Dr. Harris, who was, I think, Deputy Chief Medical Officer, as I recall. A number of members there set out. And then you, together with two colleagues, Dr. Skinner and Mr. Arthur, are recorded as comprising the Secretariat. And then we have Mr. D. Harris as an observer. So what was your role as part of the Secretariat for this particular body?
Well, we would work with Dr. Harris to devise the agenda, to discuss with him. We would have a pre-meeting where we discussed what should be on the agenda and what papers he needed to have prepared. And that would basically be my role to facilitate the meeting. But at the same time, because I was there and I had policy responsibilities for the transfusion service, quite often I would get a steer from the meeting about policy things that we needed to pursue.
And then if we just look at attendees again, in terms of the members, we can see there are representatives from the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service, Dr. Cash. There's a representative of the SHHD, so the Scottish Home and Health Department, Dr. Forrester. And then we've got Dr. Lawson, Northern Ireland, Dr. Pritchard, the Welsh office.
Yep.
So it would appear that this was one of the meetings where there was a specific role for representatives from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Was that always the case, as far as you can recall?
It would have been for a meeting of this type, where we wanted to ensure a commonality amongst the UK blood transfusion services. So it was only appropriate that their representatives were at the meeting. Some of the meetings obviously were dealing with the blood transfusion service in England, or England and Wales. So in that case, they wouldn't necessarily have representatives, although in quite a few cases, we did have representatives from the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service. And
we've heard about the nature and purpose of regional transfusion director meetings from others. We've looked at some Cbla meetings with others. In relation to this committee, the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service, what did you understand its role and remit to be?
I think it was the overarching committee, actually. It was the committee that had power to actually suggest that we had the management services team look at the structure. it was a committee that basically had the power to deal with the overview rather than the specific items that might have been addressed by lesser committees, although they did tackle some pretty important issues. And of course, it had the authority of the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, which I think was quite powerful. And it was one of the only committees that brought together all the players. It brought together the fractionators as well as the transfusion services, and as you pointed out earlier, from all the different parts of the UK.
Now, I think you also refer in your statement to sometimes attending meetings of the Haemophilia Centre Reference Centre directors. Is that right?
Yep.
And then I just wanted to ask you about a meeting that's at WITN 2189032, please, Paul, if we go to the second page. Now, these look like they're a draft set of minutes because there's a number of handwritten amendments to them. But I don't need to ask you about the detail of any of the amendments. I just want to get a sense of what this committee was. So it's a note of a meeting on the 15th of September 1986, headed Production and Supply of Coagulation Factor Concentrates by BPL Elstree. You'll see from the list of those present, it's chaired by Dr. Smithers, so your medical colleague, Alison Smithers. It's got representatives of a number of different haemophilia centre directors are there. There are representatives from BPL, Dr. Gunson is there, Dr. Krask is there for the PHLS. And then you and Mr. Arthur are recorded as being in attendance from the DHSS. And then if we just look at the first paragraph, just to get a sense of what it was about. It says the chairman, so that's Dr. Smithers, welcomes haemophilia centre directors and all other representatives against a background of the withdrawal of ARMA's heat-treated factor 8 and parliamentary questions about the use of plasma which had not been screened for HIV antibody. She hoped for a prospective discussion, and then there's a discussion about use of a stockpile at BPL. I'll come on to that particular topic at a later stage. And then if we just look further down the page, there's a discussion about factor 8Y and factor 9A, so the new BPL products. It looks as though this might have been an ad hoc meeting. It ends, I don't think I need to go to it, but with Dr. Smithers suggesting another meeting in perhaps about 6 months' time. Do you recall anything about what this particular gathering?
I don't recall it at all. I agree with you that I think it's an ad hoc meeting because otherwise it wouldn't have been chaired by Dr. Smithers. It looks to me as though it's a meeting that she called of all interested parties to actually go through the manufacture and distribution of factor 8.
And then there's just one other committee I wanted to ask you about in very general terms. If we go to PRSE 00001355, you'll see in a moment these are minutes of a regional transfusion directors meeting. This happens to be 20th of January 1988, and you were present. What I wanted to ask you about is if, a committee referred to at the bottom of page 3. So paragraph 3.6 towards the bottom of the page, management study. That's, again, the study looking at the reform of the blood transfusion service, which we'll come back to. But it says, Dr. Moore informed the meeting that a report summarising the options had been prepared for the meeting of the advisory committee. We've just looked at the advisory committee a few minutes ago. And that this report would go forward to the policy committee of the DHSS on the 10th of February, from which the preferred options would be forwarded to ministers. Well, can you help us with what the policy committee of the DHSS, what was that?
I honestly can't recall precisely. I mean, I know there was a high-level policy committee, but it was above my pay grade, and I don't recall the details.
Now, if I just ask you, as it were, to mentally stand back, thinking about this range of committees, and there's a range of further committees that you became involved when you were Deputy National Director under the National Directorate, but. how well coordinated were these committees? Were they coordinated at all?
Well, I think they were coordinated. That was part of the job that I had with Dr. Smithers. I mean, we sat on nearly all these committees. It was, and we were expected to run with any policies that might have come from those committees, and we had to make sure that the committees were coordinated. I would have thought that was very much our job.
And do you recall? It may be difficult to answer in the abstract, Dr. Moore, but do you recall the extent to which any of these committees or groups had decision-making roles, or were their roles predominantly advising or trying to reach agreement or making recommendations?
Well, it depends quite what you mean by decision-making roles. I think they all had decision-making roles, but they didn't all have the power to enforce those decisions. So I think those were different things. The advisory committee chaired by Dr. Harris, certainly because of his seniority, did have the capacity to ensure that its decisions were actually enacted. The transfusion directors were a collective, so there was no one to ensure that everything that they said was actually enacted, and the haemophilia reference centre directors likewise, they could make decisions, but they didn't all consider themselves bound by those decisions.
And so, would it be right to understand, however, that a common link across the committees you've described essentially is the participation, sometimes as observer, sometimes more directly, of the Department of Health?
That's right, yes.
You have mentioned in your witness statement, if we go to WITN 6919001, please, Paul, and go to page 4, the penultimate paragraph. So under the heading Section 2, your role at the National Directorate, the MBTS and in the DOH, in that first paragraph, 6.0, you talk there about a departmental chain of command.
Yes.
And you've described who you reported to and who they reported to in due course. Was it a fairly hierarchical system within the department at the time? I mean, everything essentially had to be approved by the person who was senior to you?
Technically, but it didn't really work like that because, I mean, people understood, let's just use me as an example, people understood my level of expertise, so my assistant secretary, his concerns were always, have you consulted Dr. Smithers? Do we have the doctors behind this? And if so, then he would be relatively happy. My undersecretary, Mr. Cashman, was rarely interested in the detail, and likewise above him. It was generally reckoned that for material that had to go to ministers, if it was signed off at assistant secretary level, then that was satisfactory. So it wasn't hierarchical to that extent. On the other hand, where there were some real policy decisions, like the ones connected with haemophilia, the ex gratia payment to haemophilia, so that was so novel that would have gone through the hierarchical chain. But on a day-to-day basis, it wasn't as hierarchical as it may look from the outside.
And then if we leave aside the ex gratia payment for a moment, because I want to come back to that later in the course of the morning, but if there were policies, initiatives, decisions that involved or potentially involved expenditure, money from the department, did that involve or require a different level of involvement, different chain of command, discussions with the Treasury, or did it depend upon the size?
Well, there was a finance division within the Department of Health, so if we were recommending or wanted to pursue something that required expenditure, we would be expected to consult with finance. So if it was a policy that we wanted the agreement of ministers on, we would be expected to consult with finance before we put the submission up to ministers, so that we could actually say, yeah, this is what we propose, and yes, we've got the money to do it.
Now, you've referred already to part of your responsibility being involvement in ministerial briefings. You also, I think, would draft replies to parliamentary questions.
Yeah.
And we'll look at some relevant examples in due course. You also, I think, would put together briefings for the press office from time to time.
Yes.
What was the criteria for whether something needed to go to the minister or the minister's private office?
The idea was, I suppose, that just from a background briefing for ministers was that there should be no surprises. So we operated on the basis that if a minister might be asked something in the House or by a colleague in the House, then he needed to be prepared. So we would always provide background briefings, you know, for example, the newspapers are talking about this is an issue, you may wish to know that, and we would make sure the minister was fully briefed.
Did you yourself have much direct contact with ministers? I know when we look at the £10 million payment, we'll talk about the involvement of John Moore as Secretary of State, but leaving that aside for a moment, other than that, did you have direct dealings with ministers?
Yeah, quite frequently face-to-face ministers. The transfusion services were usually looked after by the minister who was in the House of Lords. So we had a variety of ministers, and we would meet regularly. I mean, certainly all the parliamentary questions, the oral PQs, they would be discussed in a face-to-face briefing with ministers, and we would feel quite comfortable putting briefing to them. And if it was a major issue, then we would take the view that needed to go not just to our particular minister, PSL, that's the minister in the Lords, but also to PSH, MSH, SOS, all of them.
Now, taking briefings for ministers, first of all, and I'm asking questions here as a matter of generality. Again, if it's not possible to answer as a matter of generality, please say so. But when you would be putting together a briefing for a minister, was there any particular expectation within the department at the time you were there, 86 to 88, that it would, as to whether the briefing was expected to be very forthright, or was there an expectation that things would be sugar-coated for ministers? What was the culture in terms of what information you were going to give to ministers?
I think it had to be accurate. It had to be relatively simple, not because ministers were in any way unintelligent, but because they had a whole breadth of subjects to deal with. So it had to be, straightforward, accurate. I don't think it wouldn't be sugar-coated. It wouldn't be unnecessarily forthright unless that was needed.
And can you recall again the period 86 to the end of 88? Do you have any recollection of how central a priority the safety of blood products and the blood transfusion service was for ministers?
I would have thought they were absolutely totally aware of the need, particularly to protect, at that time, to protect the blood supply from HIV. I would have assumed that was right at the top of their agenda. It was certainly at the top of mine.
And because you joined, I think, in October 1985, HS1A, which is around the time we know that screening of the blood for HIV was introduced. What about then when you were preparing drafts of material that weren't private documents for ministers but were for public consumption? So it might be a parliamentary answer, or it might be a briefing for the press office or a press statement that you might have some involvement in. Was there an expectation that those would be presented in as positive a fashion as possible?
Yes, I suppose there was, as long as it was honest. I mean, the press office liked crunchy statements because they might need to reply to their journalistic colleagues on newspapers, and they liked something quite crunchy that might be used. But I mean, it absolutely had to be honest and accurate. The style couldn't dictate the content. I think we were concerned that the blood supply was maintained. There was a need to ensure that whatever we said didn't deter donors from giving blood. So that was always in our minds when we did make statements, but that shouldn't have affected the accuracy of them.
And then in terms of other aspects of your role, one of your roles was as a liaison with the Haemophilia Society. Is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Again, and we'll come back to the part you played in the discussions with the Haemophilia Society in due course. So I want to move now to ask you a little about a particular issue, a policy issue that came across your desk in 86 to 88, and that's the question of the policy of self-sufficiency in blood and blood products. So would it be right to understand that your knowledge, your understanding of government policy in relation to self-sufficiency effectively derives from 1985 when you took up your post?
Yes, I didn't know anything about it before then.
And as I understand your statement, by that point in time, self-sufficiency was an accepted government objective.
Absolutely.
Can you recall any discussions taking place with Scottish colleagues about self-sufficiency?
Not specifically. I'd be very surprised if we didn't know, because Dr. John Cash came to RTD's meetings, and at RTD's meetings we talked about self-sufficiency. So I would be astonished if we hadn't.
Now, by the time you took up your job, the decision to redevelop BPL had been made some time previously. I think it's right to understand that you had some involvement in, you were copied into documents in relation to decisions that then had to be made about how quickly or slowly the works were proceeding, provision of additional funding for BPL because they needed more money to complete the building project and so on. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
I'm not proposing to ask you about the detail of those, Dr. Moore. Were you, when you took up your post, or as you continued in your post, do you recall any particular discussions about benefits or disadvantages of self-sufficiency, or problems in achieving it, things that had arisen prior to you taking up your job?
Sorry, can you...
So were there discussions of which you became aware about difficulties in achieving self-sufficiency? Did you glean anything about the history and what had happened prior to the autumn of 85? Oh
yeah, absolutely. We knew it was a challenge for the transfusion service to go from a low base up to the projected inputs that were going to be required for BPL when it was fully on stream.
And so there you're talking about the issue of plasma supply, the regional transfusion centres being able to supply BPL with sufficient plasma to fractionate. When you, in due course, took up your role at the National Directorate, I think part of your role was coordinating issues relating to plasma supply. Prior to the National Directorate, so 86 to 88, was there anyone who had that role of coordinating issues relating to plasma supply?
It was done through the advisory committee. And the regional transfusion directors working together. And I rather think there was a plasma working party. I mean, Harold Gunson, Dr. Gunson very much took the lead on that. But the department was aware of targets. It was aware of what we expected regional health authorities to fund in the way of plasma procurement.
And then I think what you have referred to in your statement is that there was a variability in the funding that was available to individual regional transfusion centres in order to meet targets or objectives in relation to plasma supply. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that was a function of the way that transfusion centres were funded. They were funded from the regional health authority. So the department gave the funds to the regions, and then the regions distributed it to the regional transfusion centres. So the slice of the regional cake that the transfusion centres got very much depended on their relationship with their region. And some regions were more forthcoming than others. But it was also affected by the original way in which self-sufficiency was framed, which was that regions got blood product back in proportion to the amount of plasma that they had supplied for fractionation. So that was the blood product back was perceived to be cheaper than a commercial product. So it was to the benefit of regions that used a large amount of blood product to produce a large amount of plasma, so they would get a lot back. So that was good for them, but for other regions that didn't have such a large haemophilia population, they didn't have any financial incentive to fund plasma procurement to the same extent. So, excuse me. So that did lead to regions having different amounts of funding for plasma procurement. And we had to really overcome those hurdles before the plasma supply could actually take off.
And in the period prior to the National Directorate, what was done by the department, as far as you can recall, if anything, to try and address that particular problem?
We did a number of things. First, we told RHAs that we did expect them to fund plasma procurement, that self-sufficiency was a national government objective, and that we wished them to fund it. The problem was, at the time, the Department of Health had actually made the decision to delegate funds to the regional health authorities. So it was considered, it would have been unsatisfactory to then detail how they should spend it. So there was a strange relationship between the department and regional health authorities. They could be urged to do things, but they couldn't be told to do things that could be insisted upon. At the end of the day, it was down to them. So, but we could write letters, and we wrote letters, and these letters could go up and up and up. They could be official letters. Then we would get the minister to write the letter, and then there was a forum where the Secretary of State met with regional chairmen, and he could make it very clear then that it was his wish that this should happen, and that was generally reckoned to be the most powerful way of making things happen. And we went through all of those avenues to encourage the plasma procurement to be funded at the regional transfusion centre. The other thing we did was actually to break the link between blood products and plasma by suggesting that there should be a scheme of cross-charging. So actually regional transfusion centres would be paid by the Blood Products Laboratory, or Cbla, for the plasma that they provided, and it would have nothing then to do. There would be no pro rata blood product supply. So we broke the link between the blood products and plasma, so that encouraged regions that really didn't need a lot of blood product, nevertheless, to do their part in providing plasma.
And I may come back to ask you a little more about that system and the move from the pro-rata system to what I think was called the cross-charging or cross-accounting system. And we may come back to that. I think you've given us, in your statement, an example of a letter written to regional health authorities at RLIT 40795. This is a draft.
Yep.
I think it's right that it was sent, but I haven't got the reference, I'm afraid, for the final version to hand. But we can see what's said in the second paragraph is an expression of concern that some regional transfusion directors were pessimistic about their chances of attaining the growth in plasma procurement and meet targets. The next paragraph talks about ministers attaching considerable importance to the matter of self-sufficiency. And then the action is to arrange for your regional health authority to reconsider the steps it's taking to ensure that the plasma procurement target set for your region will be met. And then the letter continues, I'll be glad if you let me have your comments by the end of September. And then if we go over the page, what we have, so that's the draft letter, and then what I think we have here is a submission or a draft submission to the NHS Management Board. If we go to page 3, please, Paul. We've got the present position there described. Most RTCs have increased their plasma procurement so as to meet the present capacity of BPL, but some have indicated that their RHAs are not prepared to fund a further increase in plasma procurement. Other RHAs are more sympathetic but not prepared to make a long-term commitment. The department is thus faced with a situation where ministers' decision to achieve self-sufficiency with major rebuilding at BPL, investing over 24 million, is liable to be frustrated by the unwillingness of RHAs to produce the necessary raw materials for the new plant to function. The encouragement that was given to regional health authorities, do you have any recollection of how successful that policy of trying to encourage or persuade RHAs to give this more priority was?
Yeah, I mean, it was quite successful. I mean, there was always a tussle. Some regional transfusion centres always thought they were better funded than others, but this was the formality of this type of letter. It wouldn't be ignored by the regional health authority. Indeed, there was, I'm not sure whether it was this initiative or another one that was actually escalated to Secretary of State talking to regional health authority chairs.
And do you recall whether within HS1A, from a policy perspective, consideration was ever given to the question of the Secretary of State actually mandating or requiring regional health authorities to provide a certain amount of funding?
Certainly we didn't consider that within HS1A. I would have thought at the time that wouldn't have been something that the department would have done.
And is that because of that tension that, that's my word, not yours, but that what you described as being the fact that the department had given regional health authorities a degree of autonomy in providing with money, and that the department didn't want to be interfering with?
Yeah, absolutely.
If we go back to your witness statement, please, Dr. Moore, WITN 6919001, and we go to page 26. You've talked in broad terms in your statement about steps taken to achieve self-sufficiency. And then at the bottom of that page, paragraph 33.2, you say, I believe that self-sufficiency could only have been achieved earlier if BPL had been built earlier. And then you go on to describe the process of the fast-tracking of the building and so on. Top of the next page, you say this is the top line, the building itself was, in my view, the time determinant for self-sufficiency. And then you say in the next paragraph, as far as I'm aware, my views on self-sufficiency accorded with those of my peers at the time. Was that the as far as you can recall, the common view within the department that the key to achieving self-sufficiency was the rebuilding of BPL?
Yes. And
was there ever any discussion which you can recall or to which you were party to as to which shed any light on why that decision to rebuild BPL had not been taken earlier?
No, I mean, I can't recall any particular debate. I mean, my understanding was that the upgrade of BPL back in the early 80s, the £2 million upgrade was actually forced upon them by the Medicines Inspectorate. I think if you think, well, maybe we should have started at the end of the 70s, the requirement for factor 8 wasn't as considerable then as it became later. The usage leapt up. Whether people could have predicted that at the time, I don't know.
Yes, I mean, I appreciate these were all decisions taken well before you joined the department or joined HS1A. It was really about whether you can recall any particular discussions. But, and then just before we leave this particular topic in relation to plasma supply and self-sufficiency, could you please look with me at DHSC 0002017. So this is a meeting 28th of April 1988. So again, it's before you joined the National Directorate. It's headed DHSS Plasma Supply and Blood Product Working Group Medical Subcommittee. And this is the first meeting of the Medical Subcommittee on the 28th of April 1988. We can see it's a small subcommittee, Dr. Gunson, Dr. Contreras, Dr. Lane, Dr. Ritzer, Dr. Wagstaff, and you. And then if we go a little further down, it says Dr. Gunson introduced the meeting. The urgency of the problem regarding plasma supply had initiated the formation of the committee so that data could be accumulated. And then at paragraph 2, there's a heading, terms of reference. Second paragraph under that, it says the medical subcommittee, so that's this particular subcommittee, needed to consider the problem of yields and how much plasma would be required for the fractionation of factor 8 and 9. The second subcommittee would be looking at financial and distribution issues, would be chaired by Dr. M. Harris. The core group consisted of everyone from both committees, would hopefully meet June, July with Dr. E. Harris in the chair. Dr. Moore and Dr. Pickles would attend both subcommittee hearings. So it would appear that this was a subcommittee or one of two subcommittees urgently formed because of what was regarded as a particular problem regarding plasma supply. Just so that you can see what the meeting then discusses, if we go over the page. Sorry, can we go to page 2? My apologies, Paul. There's a heading, what is self-sufficiency? And then there are a range of contributions from Dr. Gunson, Dr. Lane, and others. And then if we go to the next page, under the heading plasma supply, it records Dr. Lane giving figures showing when we would run out of plasma. If plasma supply remained at its current level of 330 tonnes annually, and then figures set out, bottom of the page, plasma supply would be exhausted by Christmas 1990. By August, BPL would run out of marginal reserve. And then there's a brief discussion over the page. Now, again, I'm not asking about the detail of any decisions or discussions at that meeting, but do you recall the problem which led to what appears to be the urgent establishment of a new form of committee?
Yes, I think we wanted to get under the same roof people responsible for producing the plasma, i.e. the transfusion centres, people responsible for fractionating it, i.e. BPL and Dr. Lane, and people responsible for using blood products, which is why Dr. Charles Ritzer is there from the Haemophilia Centre directors, because we were chasing self-sufficiency, but we kept getting different estimates from the haemophilia doctors as to how much factor VIII they actually regarded as self-sufficient, how much they actually wanted to use. We were getting different comments from BPL at the time about the yields that they were getting from the plasma, so how much they could actually make. So this was an effort to actually, well, how much plasma have we actually got to produce if we want self-sufficiency? And the idea of this meeting was to get everybody in the same room and hammer it out.
To what extent, this meeting being one that took place in April 1988, to what extent had anything changed or been achieved by the time the National Directorate then took over or was set up at the end of 1988?
I think this was a very difficult time. 1988 was a difficult time for the Blood Products Laboratory because they were right in the middle of trying to scale up their production in the new facility. The new facility had only recently come online. They were having difficulty in getting the same yields of factor VIII as they had done on the smaller production lines. They were, had been clearly over-optimistic with the way that they could scale up. I mean, it was much, much harder to get the yields. In fact, the yields they were getting were about 2/3 what they'd expected at one time, which meant we would have to produce masses more plasma. At the same time, we weren't clear what the haemophilia doctors were going to do, but I think that they actually, that became reasonably stable, the consumption. I don't recall that going up markedly from 88 through to my time in the directorate. But in 89, I think it was, we introduced cross-charging, so that by the time we'd established the National Directorate, cross-charging was in place, and that transformed the ability of regions to produce plasma. So it was a very useful meeting. It defined the problem, but over the next year, many of the issues did actually resolve themselves. Or we could say we resolved them, but they were resolved.
And this, is it fair to understand, this is an example of decision-making reacting to a problem? Is it a problem that could and should have been anticipated and addressed in advance?
Well, I think it was actually ahead of the problem. It noted that unless we did something, we would actually run out, well, the Blood Products Laboratory could run out of plasma, so actually that was foreseeing it. We were ahead of the game. Could it have been foreseen earlier? I suspect we should have been less optimistic about the scale-up of BPL. That was probably the big issue at that time.
And then there was concern expressed by you slightly later on in 1988 in a memo about information from Dr. Lane and the reliability of that information. So that's DHSC 0002038. So this is you, again, still wearing your HS18 hat. This is about 3 months before you moved to the National Directorate. 29th of September 1988. And you say this in paragraph 1, at the Plasma Supply and Blood Products Working Party, chaired by Dr. Harris on Wednesday, 21st of September, Dr. Lane of BPL produced new information which has undermined our ability to achieve self-sufficiency in Factor 8. Since then, more information has come to light from BPL which further worsens the position. And then you explain what that is in paragraph 2. In summary, stocks of fresh frozen plasma which have been built up at Elstree in preparation for the new laboratory have been recorded as a gross weight, i.e. including packaging. For planning purposes over the past years, however, BPL have in error treated the gross weight as a net weight. This means that the plasma stockpile is only 330 tonnes rather than the 450 tonnes expected. You then set out some concerns about the implications of that. And then if we go over the page, paragraph 6, you say we will presumably need to alert ministers to the changed circumstances since they may not be able to talk of self-sufficiency for a few years. They will want to know how such inept planning has occurred. The finger points clearly at BPL and in particular Dr. Lane. And then paragraph 7, you say the story of the Factor 8 yield estimates demonstrates particular incompetence, and you then, again, you develop your thinking in that regard. Again, do you recall how this issue came to light and how, if at all, it was resolved?
Yeah, I would first of all. I'm rather ashamed by the wording of this. I think I was far too forthright and very unfair to Dr. Lane. I'd actually like to put that on record. It simply was. It was a mistake that was made by the Blood Products Laboratory, probably going back for years. That whoever weighed in the plasma when it arrived included the weight of the pack. I suspect it was a mistake that was made at quite low level and has simply been built into the procedures. It doesn't really excuse it, but it may explain it. And I'm sure Dr. Lane would have been just as shocked as the rest of us when it came to light. But it did, of course, mean that the stockpile was less than we had expected. It was compounded in this minute by the much lower yields. So BPL told us both those things. I mean, BPL were always absolutely straight. They wouldn't have concealed it. As soon as they found out about this error, they told me, and they also told us about the yields as well. So we had to then decide what to do with it, how far this had to go up to ministers. Was it something that could be resolved? And I believe there's a graph attached to this suggesting what we can do in order to maintain the stockpile. But in fact, it was a problem that to a great extent did melt away. The Blood Products Laboratory worked very hard on the yields, and over the next year, the yields of Factor 8 from the plasma went up considerably, and the regional transfusion centres increased the plasma supply so that there was always sufficient for the Blood Products Laboratory. So lots of the apocalyptic language in this memo was actually not justified by events.
Now, I want to move on to a slightly different aspect of your evidence in your statement. WYTN 6919001, and if we can go, please, to, first of all, to page 20, please. So I'm going to be asking you about the idea of clinical freedom in a moment, Dr. Moore, and I want to just read two passages in your statement before I ask you. So, bottom of this page, you say, I've been asked about the effect of clinical freedom on the relative usage of UK and imported blood products. I do not have full information on which to form a view. Sorry, Paul, it's the bottom paragraph. There was clearly a period when blood products needed to be imported because there was insufficient UK supply. And I believe BPL never managed to capture 100% of the market, even when it had more capacity in the early 90s. And then you say, this continued reliance on imports, so this is the second line, was presumably down to clinical freedom and the fact that some clinicians believed that the imported product was better for their patients. Paragraph 24.1, so the next paragraph, you say, in general, the downside of any clinical freedom is that a clinician might be in error. However, the alternative that some outside body should dictate the clinical treatment of a particular patient seems a worse option. There have been many attempts to bridge the gap between the two options, and then you refer to the role of clinical audit and Royal College's the role of NICE. And then if we can just go on to page 23, please, Paul. Bottom of the page, paragraph 29.2, again returns to the topic of clinical freedom. So you say, fourth line down, this recognised that the clinical freedom enjoyed by haemophilia doctors meant that it was not possible to mandate that they purchase BPL products. There would always be a small number who, for various reasons, might prefer a foreign product. And then over the page, paragraph 29.3 refers to a Council of the European Communities directive. And then you've set out a response to the directive from the Chief Medical Officer. So this is the quote in paragraph 29.3. Since 1976, it has been government policy that the UK, with its long tradition of voluntary blood donation, should be self-sufficient in blood products. This policy is entirely consistent with the more recent decision of the EC to promote a policy of community self-sufficiency based on voluntary blood donation. At the same time, ministers accord great importance to the principle of clinical freedom. When, therefore, a doctor decides, in the light of available clinical information, that a particular product is indicated for a particular patient, we believe that the decision should be respected, even if that product has to be imported from outside the EC. So those were the observations in your statement about clinical freedom, and it would appear from that quotation that's on the screen that this was very much something which was led by, or a view that was at least shared by ministers. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was a major tenet in the Department of Health that clinical freedom existed. It was recognised that clinical freedom put a limitation on what the department could do with clinicians. I mean, across all policy areas, clinical freedom was a mantra, if you like.
And do you know why it was regarded as such an important tenet?
Well, I mean, at a simple level, it's clearly a good thing to have a group of officials sitting around in Whitehall working out what the treatment should be for a particular patient, and telling a doctor what to do would clearly be a very bad thing indeed. So I think it was to try and stop the department drifting into that scenario that clinical freedom became so important. The snag with clinical freedom, I mean, it's like all the freedoms, they're not really free. Freedom of speech is curtailed. That we have academic freedom and artistic freedom, and they're all limited in some way. Clinical freedom, as I said, it's a good idea, provided the doctor is right. But having a medical degree doesn't mean you're always right. And I think, you know, there have been, I'm not saying in this particular, but there have been lots of instances where clinicians have actually been wrong, and that has led to bad outcomes for patients, which is why the department, recognising this, did try to hedge the concept of clinical freedom with medical audit, clinical audit, so that the doctors were audited by each other, so one maverick couldn't pursue some course of action just on the basis of clinical freedom that might not have good outcomes for patients. So, and the Royal Colleges started collecting data on outcomes, and that, you know, that has been really valuable. So clinical freedom is a concept that works, provided it's constrained, I think, by other factors. But in terms of this particular clinical freedom to prescribe what you want for your patient, that would still be there today. The products that the clinicians were prescribing were licensed products. They'd got approval from the licensing authority, so provided they were using those products, well, that's what the license for. The license says that's an okay product to use, so there would be no reason why they couldn't use it. So if they chose not to use BPL product, well, so be it.
And would it be right to understand that in the 1980s, and I think quite a lot of what you describe about Royal Colleges auditing outcome data, clinical audits, really comes slightly later chronologically than the period in the early or middle 1980s with which we're...
Yeah, I think clinical audit came in sort of late 80s, early 90s, and the colleges didn't really start collecting data at this time. It came in later. I mean, I think it was certainly encouraged. That was one of the outcomes of the Bristol inquiry. The Royal College of Cardiologists really had some really good data at that time, and that was kind of extended to other areas. But that wasn't until late 90s.
So was there a reluctance within the department in the 80s to be seen to be doing things that might be interpreted as a interference with clinical freedom?
I would say definitely, yes.
And if we just go back to your statement, just page 21, please, Paul. So, thank you. Paragraph 24.1. You identify there, as it were, two extremes. Might not be the right word, but you identify there a downside, clinicians being in error, and then an alternative about outside bodies dictating the clinical treatment of a particular patient. There's quite a lot of middle ground, is there not? So I don't think anyone's necessarily suggesting the department should be determining what treatment was given to an individual patient, but in the context of a new and emerging virus, topical today as it was in the 1980s, giving advice, information, guidance about what's known about that virus, about possible alternative forms of treatment, or more cautious approaches to treatment. That was something that the department could have done, could it not, in the 1980s?
Yes, to some extent, but it supposes that the department is a fount of knowledge. In fact, the information that the department was getting on the development of HIV in patients with haemophilia, much of that was actually coming from the haemophilia doctors themselves. So the department was at that time very close, talking a lot to haemophilia doctors. So I wouldn't have thought there was much advice that the department could give that the haemophilia doctors didn't know. You're suggesting perhaps that they take it a stage further and say, because of this information that we collectively hold, you should do that. And I think that's where they would say clinical freedom comes in, provided you are obviously not using an unlicensed product or doing things that are inappropriate. We would respect your clinical judgment.
So I note the time. I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic, so perhaps a good moment for the morning break.
Well, just on this this last point before we do, it's fascinating debate about clinical freedom, but the difference perhaps between clinical freedom and the other freedoms which you mentioned, the freedom of speech, academic freedom, artistic freedom, is that it is always used in the context of a clinician treating somebody else. In other words, the freedom has consequences for a particular patient. And that's not the case, I think, so much with freedom of ideas, freedom of speech, etc. If it is apparent to others, to a sufficient degree, that there may well be a better way of treating the patient, one way might be thought to give authoritative guidance in the same sort of way as your department was giving, perhaps, to the regional health authorities when it came to producing plasma, urging a particular course, leaving it to the clinician on good grounds, no doubt, to take a different course, but if they do, they take the risk of legal proceedings ultimately if they're wrong. Would that perhaps be a way of resolving the tensions between the patient's interests and the interests in the clinician in securing what he thinks, although he has to discuss it nowadays at any rate with the patient, is in the best interests of the patient?
Yes, I mean, that would work, but again, it comes back to the point that I made, that the department actually doesn't have generally any more knowledge than the field. So if it gains its knowledge from the field and puts out guidance, is that greatly different to a clinical audit or the Royal Colleges gaining advice from the field and putting out guidance to members? I mean, I suppose one could argue that if it comes with the department's seal of approval, it maybe carries more authority than something that comes from the field. Or now, of course, we have NICE, which probably fills that particular role, which the department deliberately made arm's length from itself, so that I suspect that was for financial policy reasons.
Yes. Yes, well, thank you very much. We'll take a break now generally for half an hour, so 11:45. Would that be all right for you? 11:45.
And so if you give Dr. Moore the usual advice about the evidence.
Dr. Moore, you're giving evidence. What I say to all witnesses at this stage is that when you're giving evidence, what you must not do is discuss the evidence you've given or any evidence you think that you may yet be asked to give with anyone, whoever that person is. You can talk about anything else you like.